The alarm on my wrist was screaming before I even opened my eyes. Red light bounced off the cave walls, and the ground under my boots was shaking so hard my teeth rattled. Something enormous was landing outside, and I already knew what it was. After 18 years of waiting, the sky had finally answered. My name is Daniel Voss, and I never planned on becoming anybody's father. I was a salvager, nothing more. I dug through dead empires for scraps that other people could sell. That was the whole plan, until the day I dropped into a sealed vault under the ruins of a world called Thren, and found 4 eggs glowing faintly in a bed of frozen mist. The guild wanted to crate them up and auction them off to the highest bidder. I remember standing over that stasis chamber, listening to my supervisor Owen Price talk about profit margins, and something in me just refused. I disabled the tracker on my suit, loaded the eggs onto my transport, and left that job behind forever. I did not know what I was doing. I was not a scientist. I barely knew how to keep a houseplant alive. But something about those eggs made me feel responsible, like walking away would have been a kind of theft nobody would ever be able to give back. 3 weeks later, in a rented cabin on the edge of a farming colony, the first crack appeared. I sat there for 6 hours straight, watching that egg shift and rock, terrified I would do something wrong and ruin it all. When the shell finally broke open, a small, wet, shivering creature blinked up at me with eyes the color of melted copper. It made a sound between a cough and a chirp, and then it looked directly at me and did not look away. That was Ember. She was the first, and she was the loudest for the rest of her life. Kale hatched 2 days later, calm and quiet, watching everything before he moved. Sable came next, sharp-eyed and stubborn from the very first breath. And then there was Ash, the smallest, who took nearly a week longer than the others, and nearly did not make it. I stayed awake with him every night of that week, talking to him in a voice that cracked from exhaustion, telling him it was not allowed to give up. He hatched on the 7th night, and he never let me forget it. Raising 4 dragons on a human colony was not easy, and I will not pretend it was some peaceful story. The local council wanted them registered as dangerous fauna. Xenobiologists from 3 different research stations tried to have them taken for study. I fought paperwork battles that felt harder than anything physical. I learned to cook food that would not upset 4 very different stomachs. I learned to patch scales that got scraped on rocks, and I learned that dragons, even young ones, grow faster than anything reasonable. By the time they were 2 years old, Ember could carry me on her back for an hour without tiring. By 4, Kale was reading star charts over my shoulder, correcting my navigation with a huff that I swear was him laughing at me. Sable started building things, little clever machines out of scrap metal, taking apart old engines just to understand how they worked. Ash, always a step behind physically, made up for it with a memory that never let anything go. He could recite conversations from years earlier, word for word, which made him either the best or the most annoying person to argue with. I taught them what I knew, not just survival, but the things that actually mattered. That strength was not a reason to take what belonged to someone else. That being bigger than another person did not make you right. That family was not something you inherited. It was something you built, every single day, on purpose. I never told them fairy tales about greatness or bloodlines. I told them the truth, that their kind had once ruled half the stars and then destroyed themselves doing it. I told them the empire that made them was gone, and that whatever they became next was entirely their own choice. They grew into something remarkable. Not just in size, though by the time they were 15 years old, each of them could have crushed a transport ship without much effort. They grew into people. Ember became protective of every smaller creature on the colony, chasing off predators from farmers' fields without being asked. Kale studied everything he could find about the old empire, trying to understand where it went wrong. Sable built half the irrigation systems in our valley, refusing payment because she said family did not charge family. Ash became the one who noticed when I was tired, before I noticed it myself, and who would quietly finish my chores without a word. We were happy. I want that part remembered clearly, because what came next tried very hard to take that happiness and twist it into something it was never meant to be. The first sign came 18 years after I found those eggs. Ancient signal towers buried across 3 systems flickered back to life on the same night. Nobody could explain it. Scientists panicked, colonies argued over what it meant, and through all of it, I noticed my children becoming restless. Kale stopped sleeping properly. Ember started pacing the ridgeline every evening, staring east like she was listening for something. Even calm, careful Sable snapped at me once, which she had never done before, and then apologized so quickly it broke my heart. I asked Kale what was wrong one night, sitting beside him on the rocks overlooking the valley. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He said it felt like a voice at the very edge of hearing, calling a name that was not quite his, but close enough to make his chest ache. He said it felt old, and it felt like it expected him to answer. I did not sleep again after that conversation. 3 days later, the sky tore open. I remember standing outside the cabin, watching 6 enormous shapes descend through the clouds, wings wider than the barns scattered across our valley. They did not fly like anything built by human hands. They moved with the terrible grace of creatures that had never once doubted their right to be exactly where they were. The Dragon Kings had returned. They landed in the open field just past the ridge, and the ground shook hard enough to knock loose tools off the workbench inside the cabin. My children came running from every direction, drawn by something ancient in their blood that I could never fully understand, no matter how many years I had spent raising them. I ran after them, my heart slamming against my ribs, because I knew, the moment I saw those 6 massive figures unfold themselves in the field, that everything I had built could be undone in a single afternoon. The largest of them, a dragon the color of old iron, with scars crossing one side of his face, stepped forward first. His voice, when it came, rattled the windows of the cabin behind me and rolled across the field like thunder that had learned to speak. He called himself Threx, and he called Kale and Ember and Sable and Ash by names I had never heard before, ancient titles heavy with expectation. He told them the Empire was not dead, only sleeping, and that the time had come for the last true heirs to rise and reclaim what belonged to them by right of blood. I watched my children's faces as he spoke. I watched Ember's eyes widen. I watched Kale go very still, the way he always did when he was trying to process something enormous. I watched Sable's claws dig small trenches into the dirt, and I watched Ash step slightly closer to me, without seeming to realize he had done it. Threx's gaze finally landed on me, standing small and human in the shadow of his enormous children. He asked what I was. I told him my name. He laughed, a sound like boulders grinding together, and told the others gathered behind him that this was the insect responsible for raising the last heirs of an empire that had once burned entire star systems for insult. He said it was almost impressive, in the way it is impressive when vermin manage to survive somewhere they were never meant to be. I felt Ember's low growl before I heard it, a sound that vibrated through the ground beneath my boots. Threx ignored her and addressed my children directly. He told them their true family had come home. He told them it was time to leave behind whatever small, temporary life they had built here and return to the stars, where their bloodline could finally reclaim its rightful place among the ruins of the old empire. For one long, terrible moment, nobody said anything at all. I want to be honest about what I felt in that silence. I felt afraid, not of the Dragon Kings themselves, though they were terrifying enough, but of the possibility that everything I had poured into raising these 4 creatures might simply not be enough against something as old and as certain as inherited destiny. I had no wings. I had no ancient bloodline. I had 18 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, arguments over chores, and quiet nights spent talking about what kind of people we wanted to be, against 6 enormous kings claiming the authority of an entire fallen empire that suddenly felt very small. Kale was the one who finally spoke. He asked Threx a simple question. He asked what happened to the Empire, the one they were supposedly meant to reclaim. Threx's expression flickered, just slightly, before he answered that the Empire had fallen to betrayal from within, weak-blooded dragons who turned against their rightful kings. Kale tilted his head and asked whether those weak-blooded dragons had names, or whether they simply disappeared from the story the moment they stopped being useful to it. The field went very quiet. Sable stepped forward next, and I felt my chest tighten watching her stand tall in front of a king twice her size. She told Threx that she had studied every ruin she could find from the old empire, every abandoned station, every broken record. She said the pattern was always the same: cities built on forced labor, smaller worlds stripped bare and left to die, an empire that called its own cruelty greatness, right up until the moment it consumed itself. Threx's scarred face darkened. He told her she had been poisoned by human thinking, that she had forgotten what it meant to be one of them. Sable's voice did not waver. She said she had not forgotten anything. She said she remembered exactly what it meant to be one of them, and she had chosen something different on purpose. Ember moved next, placing herself directly between Threx and me, her wings half spread, her voice steady despite the way her whole body trembled with tension. She told him that this insect, as he called me, had sat awake for entire nights making sure her brother survived his hatching. That this insect had gone hungry more than once so that 4 growing dragons could eat first. That this insect had stood in front of council chambers and research committees and anyone else who tried to take them away, and had never once backed down, despite being smaller and weaker and completely outmatched every single time. She told him that greatness measured in conquered stars meant nothing next to that. Threx's patience finally cracked. He told the four of them that sentiment was a weakness bred into them by their surroundings, and that it was time to remember what they truly were. He raised one massive claw and gestured to the other 5 kings spread out behind him, an unmistakable threat wrapped in the language of invitation. I stepped forward then, moving in front of my children before I had fully decided to do it. My legs were shaking, my hands were shaking. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I stood there anyway, looking up at a creature that could have ended me without any effort at all. I told Threx that he could threaten me all he wanted, but he was not taking my children anywhere they did not choose to go. He looked down at me the way someone looks at an insect that has, against all odds, refused to move off the road. He asked what exactly I intended to do about it. I did not have an answer that involved strength, because I had none to offer, so instead, I told him the truth. I told him that his empire built dragons who obeyed. I told him that I had raised dragons who chose. And I told him that the difference between those two things was the entire reason his empire was a graveyard of ruins while my family was standing here, alive, in front of him. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind moved through the field. My children stood beside me, wings tense, waiting. Then Ash, quiet Ash, the one who had taken the longest to hatch and had spent his whole life being underestimated for it, stepped forward and spoke for the first time since the kings had landed. He told Threx that he remembered every word of every story I had ever told them, word for word, the way he remembered everything. He said he remembered the story about the Empire's fall, and he remembered that it was not betrayal that ended it. It was cruelty, finally running out of things to conquer, and turning on itself because it had never learned any other way to exist. He said he did not want to be part of a story that ended that way again. Threx's composure finally broke entirely. He roared, a sound that shook loose rocks from the ridge above us, and took one heavy step forward, close enough that his shadow swallowed the 4 of them whole, and me along with them. For one terrible heartbeat, I thought that was it, that 18 years of careful, stubborn love was about to be answered with exactly the kind of violence Threx had spent his whole life believing was the only real language worth speaking. But Ember did not move back, neither did Kale, or Sable, or Ash. They stood their ground, wings spread, forming a wall between their king and the one who had raised them. And something in Threx's expression shifted. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to recognition, the specific kind of shock that comes from realizing the world has moved on, without waiting for permission. He looked at 4 dragons standing united, unwilling to bow, unwilling to run, and completely unimpressed by the weight of his authority. He looked at them the way someone looks at a mirror that no longer shows the reflection they expected. Behind him, the other 5 kings shifted uneasily. One of them, smaller than the rest, with pale golden scales, finally spoke up, her voice far quieter than Threx's had been. She asked whether it was truly worth destroying the very heirs they had traveled across dead systems to find, simply because those heirs had built something the old empire never managed to build for itself. Threx did not answer immediately. His claws remained raised, hovering in the tense air between threat and retreat. I do not know exactly what shifted in him during that silence. Maybe it was the golden-scaled king's question. Maybe it was watching 4 dragons choose each other and their human father over an inherited crown they had never asked for. Maybe 18 years of building something quiet and real was simply harder to destroy than centuries of ruling through fear. Slowly, deliberately, Threx lowered his claw. He told my children that they were fools, that they were throwing away a legacy older than the stars they lived under. But his voice had lost the thunder it carried when he first landed. It sounded, for just a moment, almost tired. Kale answered him gently, which surprised me more than anything else that had happened that day. He said that legacies were not owed to anyone, simply because of the blood they were born with. He said a legacy had to be built, carefully, on purpose, the same way he and his siblings had been raised. He said if the Empire wanted a future worth returning to, that future would have to be built the same way, not seized the way the old one once was. Threx studied him for a long moment, then looked past him to me, still standing my ground despite every instinct telling me to collapse from exhaustion and fear. He asked, in a voice quieter than I ever expected from him, what exactly I had done to raise creatures capable of standing against kings without flinching. I told him the truth. I told him I had simply loved them, every single day, without asking for anything back. Something passed through his scarred face that I could not fully name. Not defeat exactly. Something closer to the beginning of understanding. The 6 kings remained in that field for 3 more days. They did not attack again. Instead, strangely, carefully, they began to ask questions. They wanted to know how a colony this small had built irrigation systems that outperformed anything from their old empire's ruins. They wanted to know why the local farmers spoke of my children with genuine warmth instead of fear. They wanted to understand what exactly had been built here, in this quiet, unremarkable valley, that had somehow produced heirs stronger in spirit than anything centuries of conquest had ever managed to create. On the fourth day, they left as suddenly as they had arrived, rising into the sky in that same terrible grace, disappearing back into the dark between stars. Before he left, Threx paused above the ridge, looking down at the five of us standing together in the field, and said only this, that perhaps the Empire's true mistake had never been its fall, but its refusal, across 1,000 years, to ever consider raising something instead of simply ruling it. Then he was gone, and the sky closed quietly behind him. I do not know if the Dragon Kings will return again someday. I do not know what they will decide to build, wherever it is they went. But I know that on that evening, standing in a field with 4 dragons who had chosen, deliberately and completely, to remain exactly where they were, I understood something about parenthood that no guild contract or scientific study could have ever taught me. You do not raise something powerful by teaching it to conquer. You raise something powerful by teaching it to choose, again and again, what kind of creature it wants to be, even when an entire empire arrives at your door demanding otherwise. That night we sat together on the same ridge where Kale used to stare east, listening for a voice that no longer called to him. Ember leaned her head against my shoulder, far too large now to actually fit, but she did it anyway, the way she always had since she was small enough to hold in 2 hands. Sable was already sketching plans for a new well she wanted to dig before winter. Ash recited, quietly and perfectly, every word Threx had spoken in that field, already turning it into a story he would probably tell for years. Kale simply looked at me and said thank you. For everything. In a voice too full to say much more than that. I told him there was nothing to thank me for. I told him I had only ever done what any parent should do, which was to show up, every single day, and choose them, exactly as they were. Above us the stars kept turning the same way they always had, indifferent to empires and kings and quiet valleys full of stubborn, ordinary love. But down here, on solid ground, surrounded by the family I had chosen, and the family that had chosen me right back, none of that distance mattered at all. We were exactly where we were supposed to be.